One day, you're wild, free, and spontaneous, living each moment like anything could happen next. And then, before you know it, you wake up and realize you're living the same day for the 5,000th time. And it doesn't happen all at once. At first, that routine feels comfortable, like you've finally gotten things under control. But soon, it's like you're stuck in a loop. The same habits, the same thoughts, the same patterns keep showing up. And every time you break free or make a change, it's like you're right back where you started. I know because I lived it on many levels of intensity. For years, I was just stuck in my own loops. And when I say loops, I mean the big ones: addiction, bulimia, drinking too much. Even the endless cycle of promising myself I'd stop, only to find myself right back at it the next night. It felt like I was always on the verge of change, telling myself tomorrow would be different. And then there I was, right back in the same damn place. And maybe you know that cycle too. Maybe for you it's also wine. Or maybe it's the endless promises to finally do that thing you've been talking about forever. The business idea, the new hobby, reaching out to an old friend. And you hit a point where you don't even trust yourself to follow through, to create your own life the way you want it. And it's a scary place to be when the one person you should rely on can't keep their own promises. Well, one night, I had an experience that showed me just how deep those loops went. I'd taken a little too many mushrooms, and suddenly I was trapped in this really strange mental loop, reliving the same few seconds over and over again, like hundreds of times. It was like a waking nightmare, fully aware of what was happening, but just felt totally powerless to break free. And it was a slap in the face, really. It was like an extreme version of a reminder that my life was a version of that same loop, one that I couldn't seem to escape no matter how many times I'd promised myself that I would change. Well, if you felt trapped in a loop like that, you know how it feels. And maybe for you, it's not something visible, like an addiction or a habit. Maybe it's quieter, a fear that keeps you from making bold choices, a doubt that stops you from trying new things, or just the weight of knowing that you're not living life on your terms. So how do we break the cycle? How do we step out of these old loops and start creating something real, something that feels like ours? How do we consciously create our lives from the inside out? Well, that's what we're talking about today. And our guest is TJ Woodward, a transformational coach and author who dives into the power of conscious creation. TJ's work is all about unraveling the patterns that keep us in autopilot mode so we can take back control, break free from all of these loops, and start living fully. TJ is also a featured thought leader on wholehearted.org, along with Brené Brown, Marianne Williamson, and Dr. Gabor Mate. So 3 key things we will learn today are how to spot and break out of subconscious loops that keep you stuck, practical ways to start consciously creating a life that's actually yours, and tools for creating real, lasting change in every part of your life. Before we go deep today, I want to give you a little gift, and I want to give it to you every single day. It's called the Morning Mind Love. I know how life can be. You're all fired up after an inspiring episode, and then a new day or a new challenge comes at you, and it's just hard to keep up that energy. Well, the Morning Mind Love is kind of like an oracle from your higher self to help you start each day with a positive focus. Plus, when you sign up, you get 2 free gifts, a 30-minute binaural meditation and 30 days of journaling prompts to help you remember who you truly are. And it's all completely free. So join over 9,000 people and go to mindlove.com to sign up or text the word morning to 33777.
Because the greatest freedom we can experience is freedom from the reactive impulse. And one can say it's deep in our DNA, right? Early in the evolution of humanity, we lived in caves, and if we went out of the cave, we might get eaten. So this fear response is something that keeps us alive and keeps us safe. The issue for many of us is it's a perceived threat that isn't actually what's happening. I say if it's hysterical, it's historical, right? If I'm having a massive reaction, it's usually not what's happening. And we often project, she shouldn't have said that. He shouldn't have done that. Instead, it's like, ooh, whoa, I'm having this big reaction. I pause and say, what am I feeling? What is the possibility of healing?
Turn up your frequency with Mind Love. Bite-sized brain hacks for seekers, dreamers, and doers. It's time to give your mind a little love with your host, Melissa Monti.
So, what first sparked your journey into exploring conscious creation?
Well, my own journey led me to a place where at one point in my life, honestly, things started falling apart when I had a higher vision for my life. I had a successful business and I was honestly getting deep in debt and just not willing to let go of that life that I had built. And I kept having this inner knowing that I wanted to be a spiritual teacher, be an author, and those messages were coming through. And full transparency, for a full year, I said no to that. And finally, I said yes. And once I said yes, things started to crumble. And there was a moment when I said, okay, I want to move forward in my life in a more conscious way. So I can either go back, be unconscious, continue the same patterns I've always been using, or I can start to really consciously create my life.
I love that. I went through a very similar journey, and that's really it's such a huge shift realizing that we're always creating. And until we realize that we are always creating, then we're just sort of doing it unconsciously. And so we don't realize how many of the things that we wish weren't in our lives, we sort of created the circumstances to bring it right to us.
That's right. We're always creating, like you said, but either unconsciously creating or consciously creating. And in my case, and I think a lot of people relate to this, I wasn't even aware at some point in my evolution that I was creating anything. I just thought life was happening to me. And then at some point, maybe 30 years ago, I started, entering into new thought and getting some information about how we're creating our life. And then I went into the just continuing to unconsciously create, but realizing that I had a part in it. And honestly, in some ways, that was even more difficult until I finally realized, oh, this is about healing the past and overcoming the ideas, the beliefs, and honestly, the frequency that I was carrying that kept replicating itself over and over and over again.
What was the most difficult thing to grapple with around the things that you realized you were kind of unconsciously bringing into your life?
Well, I think it started with just finding myself asking questions like, why does this keep happening to me? Why do I keep attracting these people? Why do I keep attracting issues with money, et cetera? And like I said, at some point, that awareness, actually, I went into blame. So I think that was probably the most difficult period because when it was just the world happening to me, I was kind of in a victim mode. And I'm like, oh gosh, why does this keep happening? When I realized that I was actually the creator of that, I went into blaming myself. And I went into blaming myself for a long period of time. And I think that was probably the most painful part until I realized that it's not about blame, it's about accountability and then healing so that I can start to create what I actually desire.
From the surface level, when people are just sort of tapping into this understanding, a lot of times people come in and they're like, oh, wait, so this school of thought is saying that you're the one responsible for your traumas. What would you say to people that have that question?
Yeah, absolutely. And I'm so grateful for the question. We want to be clear that that's not what we're saying. What I'm saying and what my experience has been is that I found myself choosing situations over and over again, not from a place of blame, like I keep doing this or it's my fault, but from a place of, I wonder what it is deep within me. What is the core false belief or what vibration am I carrying that is causing me to replicate this over and over again? It's kind of nuanced because someone might hear me and say, but what he's really saying, you're the one creating it. Really, what we want to do is we want to say, okay, let me pause and look at the patterns that have repeated throughout my life. Those situations that I keep finding myself in, those are the ones we want to look at that we're probably choosing on some unconscious level. And the great news is we can heal that because as long as we're blaming out the outsides, we're stuck in a pattern of hopelessness when we say, oh, I'm going to actually empower myself to do the deeper healing. So there is an interesting hallway. And in my experience, I went into that blame cycle and that kept me stuck as well.
Yeah, I went through a long phase of being ashamed of my past. And it took me years and years in self-development to realize that that wasn't serving me at all. And it was hard to see because on one hand, I was making a lot of strides because I didn't want to be like that girl anymore. But then I hit a plateau because I was demonizing this young person. And I remember doing a self-development exercise where I was writing a letter to my past self and thanking her and really realizing that as many horrible decisions as that young girl made, she's also the one that took the first steps to lead me on the path that I'm on now. I guide this meditation where I have people sort of confront that past self that they feel the most shame around. And it just seems to crack people open because you don't really realize the pain that you've been holding or that you're rejecting a part of yourself by doing that and seeing like, she was just lost. She was coping. She was doing what she needed to do to survive the moment, to get her needs met in the only ways that she knew how at the time. Oh, it actually brings up emotion even just thinking about now.
Yeah, and I think one of the things you're pointing to is so important, and that is many of us haven't even allowed ourselves to feel. And we go into, like, we have these traumas in our early life, and we absorb the pain and we start to decide things about ourselves. I call them core false beliefs. And I only say I because I add the word false. So we develop these core false beliefs about ourselves. And then at some point, that becomes the operating system. And then from there, as you said, we have all sorts of brilliant strategies. So instead of calling them coping mechanisms, I call them brilliant strategies. And I had some really absurd, brilliant strategies in my early 20s. And like you said, I think what I'm hearing you say is then I had more shame about those strategies. And was a place of compassion where I was able to integrate and really realize that the 5-year-old, the 6-year-old, the 7-year-old me that had these traumatic experiences, and I developed this deep shame about myself. We often hear people say, I feel ashamed because I did this. And I want to ask, is it possible that the shame is the reason that we did it? And then, like you said, and I love what you brought in, love and compassion for the decisions I made. Obviously, I would go back and make different decisions now, but I was also doing the best I could with what I was carrying about myself all throughout my 20s, for sure.
I find that people really resonate when we share specific examples. Can you share one of your absurd coping mechanisms or absurd false beliefs and how the process of realizing that and then kind of coming back to it to heal?
Yeah, absolutely. I always love sharing my own journey. And then I'm going to go back and actually talk about being a very young child, what I and many people call the pre-programmed human, right? I was very young, very open, very loving, very much in touch with my feelings. I think that's the innate human experience. I grew up in a household where what people were saying and what people were doing and the energy I felt were three totally different things. Some of the men in my life had, to put it as an understatement, hypersexuality, right? We might probably today we would call them perpetrators. Back then, it was sort of just normalized, at least in my family. A mother who didn't want to be a mother and who didn't want to be in a marriage. So through a series of events called Life on Planet Earth, I remember at age 7, like it was yesterday, closing my heart. I can actually remember a physical sensation. And at that moment, I decided I wasn't good enough and I was unlovable. That became my operating system. And when I was 14, I discovered drugs and alcohol. That was my first really brilliant strategy. I think my first really brilliant strategy was going into my room and closing the door. So like checking out has always been a strategy for me. And then when I found drugs and alcohol, that brought me a lot of relief. Of course, it didn't keep working that way, but I got sober when I was 20. But for those early years, it did help initially.
Yeah, I feel like my childhood strategy was really just solidifying that I was on my own. And I could see it how the belief came in from like 11 different areas, but I I found it easier to feel really confident that I could handle everything on my own than the vulnerability of relying on people and then having them let me down. Because when they let me down, in my mind, it wasn't about them, it was about my worthiness or my ability to keep deep friendships. And it's actually something that I still work on today. I think marriage has been really healing for me because I've had to open that up, and then children has been another level. But I still sometimes finding myself just like taking care of myself first and then like, or like I'll take care of everyone else and then I'll take care of myself. Sometimes even with a little different meal. I don't even know how to explain it, but I'm like, why am I doing that again? Just merge, just merge with your family. And it's difficult. It's a work in progress. Do you ever find yourself slipping back to those old belief patterns? And then how do you catch yourself and make sure that you go back onto the conscious path? You know what's funny? We spend so much time feeding our minds, reading books, listening to podcasts, learning new things, but then we grab whatever's convenient to feed our bodies. And I get it. Life is busy, and sometimes a drive-through feels like the only option. But that's why I take Field of Greens. It's a greens powder made with whole organic fruits and vegetables. No extracts, no lab-made stuff, and just 1 scoop a day gives you simple, real nutrition. Field of Greens feeds your body with fruits and vegetables medically chosen to support your heart, vital organs, and immune system. And let me tell you something. Since I started taking it, I've noticed these little changes that show me how nutrient depleted I must have been before. Like the ridges in my nails, gone. My sleep, so much better. And my stomach just feels happy. You know that dreaded afternoon crash that has you reaching for more coffee or sugary snacks? Well, that's not happening for me anymore. When your body is actually nourished, it runs so much better. I've tried other greens powders before, but Field of Greens is genuinely different. The quality is next level, and you can taste it. It's become my go-to, especially on those days when my eating isn't exactly Instagram worthy, because we all have those days, right? And here's the thing. They are so confident that you'll love it too, that they offer a 100% money-back guarantee. That's how much they believe in their product. So I got you 15% off your first order and free rush shipping. Visit fieldofgreens.com and use promo code MINDLOVE. That's promo code MINDLOVE at fieldofgreens.com. Fieldofgreens.com. I don't know why it took me so long to invest in good bedding. I resisted it for years, but something flipped in me about 3 years ago. And now I'm basically a pillow connoisseur. I've tried them all, and I get weirdly excited about good bedding. Because here's the thing, we spend a third of our lives in bed, and the quality of that time affects literally everything else, which is why I'm so excited to tell you about my latest obsession, Lagoon Sleep Pillows. What sets them apart is their matching system. You take a quick 2-minute quiz about your sleep style and your preferences, and then they match you with your perfect pillow. I was matched with their Otter pillow, and I am so impressed. Lately, I've just needed more support, and this seems to cradle me in all the right places. I'm also low-key obsessed with their travel pillow, which I use for way more than just travel. I actually hug it, use it as leg support, and of course, take it on trips with me. Well, the secret is in their adjustable fill. You can add or remove it to get that perfect alignment for your spine. A study even found that the right supportive pillow can improve sleep quality by 63%. And Lagoon lets you try their matched pillow for 100 nights risk-free. Free returns, no questions asked. Falling asleep has never been easier. I toss and turn less and just wake up feeling refreshed every morning. Go to lagoonsleep.com and take their awesome 2-minute sleep quiz to find your match. Use the code MIND for 15% off your first purchase. Do you ever find yourself slipping back to those old belief patterns? And then how do you catch yourself and make sure that you go back onto the conscious path?
Well, I think this is such an important part of the conversation because at some point in my evolution, I thought there was a finish line, right? Like I'm going to be completely free of all of these. But now I understand, and what you just shared makes so much sense because when we're really young, especially, under 10 years old, our brains aren't even developed. I mean, we know they're not even fully developed until 26 now. But when we're really young, we end up absorbing things and deciding things that are monumental. Like for me to decide I was damaged or broken at age 7, and then relief from that became an automatic strategy, right? So it's very deep within me, these automatic responses when things get difficult. Like I said, I went in my room, closed the door, kind of went into fantasy, played with my toys. And so when things got difficult in my early adult life, I would find myself numbing out. And then I was judging myself for numbing out and trying to stop numbing out. But there is a place of compassion and love that we get to meet where I say, oh, that might still be something that I automatically do, but with conscious awareness, I can observe that. And the deeper healing, as I think both of us know well, is really going back to that tender young age when we decided and really caring for that our younger self, that which we didn't get before.
I love the concept that you share in your book around living in the question. And I think it's such an important topic to dive into because it can be confused with always seeking. Like, I thought it was a good thing that I was always searching for answers. And one thing that I'm often sharing is that for a long time, I got this obsession with finding the truth. And I think a lot of it started because I was raised with a lot of religious dogma and Christianity. And there were a lot of inconsistencies that I saw or holes in the story that I was told. And so I would ask questions genuinely interested. And sometimes I'd be like kicked out of Sunday school because I'm like, well, if aborted babies go straight to heaven, I don't understand. And they're like, thinking I'm trying to just be a pill, but really I'm genuinely curious. Anyways, so I got obsessed with like finding the truth. And so I'd go down one path and it would say something and then it's something contradictory. Now I feel like I've found a peaceful sort of middle of realizing what a lot of things have in common and feeling pretty solidified in my beliefs. But one of my big beliefs is I believe that we're always going to evolve our understanding. So what I believe now, the moment that I think it's right and it's solid and it's unchangeable, I'm probably on the wrong path. My belief is that this endless curiosity is going to guide me. So, how do you explain the difference between always chasing answers and living in the question?
Well, I love what we're exploring now because to me, this is so important because when we are seeking answers, we're often looking for something outside of us to try to either heal something or answer something that feels out of alignment within. So I always start the conversation by saying we came into the world as whole and complete, whole and perfect beings, and then we were programmed to believe we're damaged or limited in some way. So when we believe we're broken or damaged, we will often look to the world to bring us answers. That's that seeking, right? I remember at one point I was called myself a spiritual seeker, like always seeking, but this seeking was outside for these concrete answers to life. What happens after we die? What is the meaning of life? In all these externals. And at some point, I started to understand that living in the question and being curious actually opens us up rather than thinking, oh, I'm asking this question so I can have a specific and concrete answer. Living in the question is asking open-ended questions that will allow me to raise my consciousness and open up to a different way of seeing things. When I anchor in spirit or in that essential being as a starting point, I realize that this true safety lies within that. Then I'm open and I'm curious rather than thinking there's a right and a wrong. And we can see that played out in the world. You know, there's so much division caused by specific answers and one group thinking they have the answer and then another group, you know, down the street has a completely different answer that they believe is the truth.
And the truth is, it's probably true for both of them because our beliefs are consistently creating our reality. That's
Right.
one thing I feel like I has come with humility as I've aged, where there has been so many times where I've like found the right way to eat and I feel like it's right for everybody. And then I do it for 5 years and I'm like, actually, I feel like I'm going to die. So this whole time I've been wrong. And then, and then I switch to another one and that's the right way. And with enough switching and enough conviction that ends up sort of disintegrating along the way, I'm like, what's right for me is not always right for somebody else. And what's true for me is, I mean, that was true for me for a time because I wholeheartedly believed it. And I think our
That's right.
beliefs shape our reality more than objective circumstances because we're all seeing the objective circumstances through a subjective light and creating our own truth around it.
Well, that's right. And when I really understand that, not only can I have curiosity for myself, but I can also have compassion for others, right? When I believe I am my opinions, my points of view, or I'm not aware of what we're really doing here, which is creating our reality or projecting our reality based on the camera or the lens that we're holding, right? So it's belief, it's frequency, it's core decisions we have about ourselves and the world. So if someone sees themselves as damaged or broken, they will see that in the world. And when I understand that, there's this amazing moment of compassion for everyone else on the journey, because then I'm not so solidified in my opinions. I can start to become curious. And when we call it confirmation bias now. So if I say the world is a kind and loving place, can I find evidence to support it? If I say the world is brutal and hostile, can I find evidence to support it? They're both true on some level. The question is, what do I want to create in my life? What do I want to focus on? So if I believe I'm limited, damaged, or broken, I will continually experience that in the world. When I go in and start to unlearn some of these ideas, reconnect with my true nature, using the open-ended question process to expand my awareness, then I start to realize, wow, life is actually filled with infinite possibilities. The only person that's truly limiting it is me. And I realize there are conditions in the world. We're not denying that. But when I really started to play with it, I started to get these results and say, oh my gosh, we really are creating our life way more than many of us are aware of.
I used to get really frustrated with my mom because there's seems to be so many expectations, and not just on me, on everything. Not, not even just everyone, on everything. Like, this is the way that it should be. This is the way that you are polite when going to a party. This is the way that you host a party. This is the way. And it seems so exhausting. And I'd get frustrated because I'm like, why are you doing this to me? And then I had this understanding, oh, this is the cage you're living in. Every time you go to a party, this is how you should be. And because you're holding yourselves to such high standards, it feels crazy to you that no one else is giving that same kind of care. And I'm like, I get that. And also, I wonder how much happier you would be if you just let go.
That's right. And that's the key, really. The phrase, would you rather be right or happy, comes to mind. And I think that when I understand, as we said, I'm really projecting my viewpoints onto reality constantly. It's like life is 10% what happens and 90% how I perceive it, right? And that perceiver is what really creates the experience. Two people can have the exact same experience, call it something totally different, and therefore have a different experience of it, right? Someone gets a diagnosis and they're like, oh, this is horrible and this is terrible and oh my gosh. Right. And then they start to experience that. Another person will say, okay, I have this diagnosis. Now what? How do I work toward healing? What do I want to do with this? How do I make this work for me? We now have a phrase in our culture called toxic positivity. That's not what I'm talking about. Toxic positivity is saying, let's pretend like it's not happening. Not at all. Life is happening, but I can easily look at someone and, it's always interesting. I can see it so clearly in my parents, but it took me a while to see it in myself, right? But like you said, like, okay, I can see how my mom's reality, her points of view have created her reality over and over and over again. And then I said, wow, I know I must be doing that too. And in that exploration, I found so much freedom. But of course, at first, like I said, it was difficult because I started blaming myself. And then I reached a point, wow, this isn't about what is right or wrong. This is about what gets created when I live from this awareness, what might get created if I were to live from a different awareness or a different possibility.
It's so funny how I remember hearing my whole life, one day you'll get to an age where you start to realize you're becoming your mother. And I was like, absolutely not. And then now I'm at that age. And it's funny because I have so much awareness around this area, and I have for like 15 years. And even so, I find that I'm really great at creating a different experience in certain situations, the ones that I'm able to practice. But then I'll be like thrown into something totally different, like somebody will give me photos of myself edited in a way I don't love. And I'm like, this shouldn't be this way. It's like, it's the little things that are so minor that I don't feel the need to bring this whole conscious awareness to it. And then I'm just like, what am I just getting sucked into? This is the most absurd, ridiculous waste of my thought energy or my emotional energy, really. And so I'm curious though, what is the most effective way that you've found to catch yourself when you're falling into that rightness trap?
Yeah, thank you for that. And I know you asked me that a little earlier. How do we have awareness, right? There was a wise person once said there are only three steps: awareness, awareness, and awareness, right? So as once something gets touched, right? Because that's what we're talking about. Like I find myself having this reactive impulse. We want to be able to pause and then check in with what we're actually feeling, right? And then asking those open-ended questions. Someone says something or does something, I find myself getting activated. I use the term activated rather than triggered because often when we say trigger, we're saying you triggered me. My mom triggers me. My boss triggers me. My partner triggers me, often outside of ourselves. When we say, oh, something just got touched, that alone, that awareness that it's mine that's getting touched, because if someone comes up and says, you're a bank robber, I'm not going to get activated by that. I've never considered robbing a bank. That's not an issue for me.
I
But
have.
if they say something, how was it? Did you act on that or did
No, but I think about it most times I drive by.
so you might have a different activation, right? So I
How'd
think
you
that
know?
the key is to be aware of what I'm actually experiencing and then to ask myself, what am I making this mean? What am I feeling? What's a different way to see this? How can I respond in a unique or new way? So there's a lot of things we can do, but it really is about, for me, awareness of what's getting touched.
That reminds me of a story Don Miguel Ruiz tells where, there can be a line of people and you go tap all of them on the shoulder and no one's affected. And then one person jumps back and it's because they already had a wound there. And so that's what I love about activated. And another thing I love about the word is it doesn't have such a negative connotation that when you say triggered, even though you're recognizing, oh, I'm the one that's triggered, and I've said before, your triggers are your responsibility, there's still this negative connotation like, oh, I'm going down this pattern again. But instead, if you're just activated, there's not a necessary neural pathway loop that you have to go down. You get to choose, okay, yes, I'm feeling very heightened. My senses are heightened right now. What do I do with it? And it to me, it more recognizes the choice point of where you're going to go from that activation, what you're going to do from that extra energy that you've just sort of risen to the surface.
That's right. I mean, Don Miguel Ruiz says, it's not your words that hurt me, it's that you touched an unhealed wound. And what I'll add to that is the unhealed wound is getting touched because it's wanting to heal if I allow that to be the experience. Because the greatest freedom we can experience is freedom from the reactive impulse. And one can say it's deep in our DNA, right? Early in the evolution of humanity, we lived in caves, and if we went out of the cave, we might get eaten. So this fear response is something that keeps us alive and keeps us safe. The issue for many of us is it's a perceived threat that isn't actually what's happening. I say if it's hysterical, it's historical, right? If I'm having a massive reaction, it's usually not what's happening. And we often project, she shouldn't have said that. He shouldn't have done that. Instead, it's like, ooh, whoa, I'm having this big reaction. I pause and say, what am I feeling? What is the possibility of healing? And it's almost always something that I can tie back to when I was 4, 5, 6, or 7 years old. And it's not about knowing where it came from, it's knowing what to do with it. That's a really different way of being, because someone gets tapped on the shoulder, they have the massive response. It really is, what do we do when we have the massive response, not just an awareness that we have it.
I love that you brought that up because it's been coming up a lot lately where people are like, well, I don't really know where this came from. And I believe that you don't always need to. Sometimes it can be helpful to, if you are the type of person that really needs that why understanding, like this doesn't make sense, like, and you're going to keep ruminating about that. And I think I used to be that way. And now I'm more like, well, where do I go from here? Okay, if I have time or if I'm deep in meditation and it comes up, maybe I'll follow that that train of thought there and see the root of it. But it's not always helpful because it's sometimes it makes it more difficult because then it's more difficult not to blame. Oh, that was the person who first activated this in me or whatever. Or then that keeps coming up and it's like, okay, I know it's about what I'm going to do with this, but you do know that you planted this seed, right, Mom?
That's right.
And so instead it's like, well, can you really develop that grace and in being grateful to the person for reflecting back to you this unhealed wound that might have lied dormant, but it's still there, probably causing some sort of chaos that you're not aware of because it's supposedly inactivated. But usually that means that it's just in the subconscious, not in the conscious layer. So thank people, like be grateful. Thanks for being a total bitch because you just rose this to my consciousness or whatever it is.
That's right. I mean, that is sort of the quote unquote advanced course. We can actually thank the sender because when I understand that if I'm having a big reaction, it's really more about something unhealed within me. And when I say unhealed, I don't mean there's something wrong there. I just mean there's something being touched so we can actually heal it. And then when we're curious about what we're feeling rather than what they just said, we have an opportunity. So in that way, we can say thank you to the sender. But I love what you're saying because it kind of comes back to the very first question we asked, which is, what's the difference between living in the question and seeking answers? In my own journey, I spent, I would say, probably most of my 20s trying to figure out why I was feeling something and what was the root of it. And I thought if I can just figure out the root of it, then I would be free of it because I didn't really understand yet that it's actually still alive within me, right? The trauma lives within me. Bessel van der Kolk says, trauma doesn't show up as a memory, it shows up as a reaction. And when I'm curious about the reaction rather than the root of it, I can actually then start to be curious about how to work with it and heal it and actually use that in my journey instead of trying to get rid of it.
It reminds me of physical symptoms versus root causes. It's the same thing where it's like if we're always just trying to get rid of the symptoms, you take the medication to not feel the pain, then it's like, okay, but you still have the knee issue, and now you're just exacerbating and you can't feel the pain. And so it's going to just break on you. And the same things happen with our emotional wounds where it's like, okay, yeah, you can keep stuffing that down. You can keep having the glass of wine instead of confronting it. But do you know how many of your subconscious patterns, like potentially destroying relationships when they start to get too deep, or sabotaging your own dreams, not taking actions on the things that you really want? That's how those things manifest because you've got this wound that you are too afraid to look at.
That's right. Yeah, and what you're speaking to, I think, is a really important conversation and much deeper, and that is when we're only trying to eradicate symptoms, we're not getting to the root, right? Whether that's physical, intellectual, emotional, or spiritual. If we're not getting to the root, and I have the honor of working in the behavioral health field, and a lot of the models that are put in place are what are your symptoms? We label them as either positive or negative symptoms. We give a diagnosis based on these quote unquote negative symptoms, and then we figure out how to eradicate or reduce them. And although that is useful, it's not always getting to the root of the matter. And the root of the matter is almost always shame and a disconnection from our true nature, a belief that we're damaged or broken, that frequency that we're carrying about ourselves. When we get to the root of it, we can actually start to have a different experience of ourselves. And then the symptoms actually start to work themselves out in many ways, right? And as you said, if we're only numbing or treating the symptoms, whether that's drugs and alcohol or another strategy, or even a medical professional who's trying to reduce these symptoms, and I'm not saying there's anything inherently wrong with it, but if we're going to do that, in addition to that, we also want to be curious about the root causes.
I remember when I was in my 20s and I was really getting serious about, I didn't know the language at the time, but it was about consciously creating my life. I was like, how do I make changes? How do I become like these people who seem to create a life that they actually love? And everything kept coming back to awareness. I'm like, okay, I'm aware. Now what? Like, and then I'd fall into the trap of being right or unconsciously creating or whatever it is. And I'm like, how is it possible to be so aware all the time? What would you say to somebody who is at that stage of awareness?
Well, I think the greatest gift we can offer ourselves is looking at life as a great experiment, right? So if I'm looking at life as an experiment, I can say, oh my gosh, I find myself frustrated by this, or why does one, when I'm comparing myself to someone else, I'm thinking about my friend from high school who has become wildly successful, and I always knew he would be because his core beliefs were like, I'm going to do it no matter what. Maybe that was his strategy to something, but I was next to him saying, but I'm unworthy, right? And so we had these different realities, and for a long time I judged myself. Well, why can't I be more like him? And first of all, I don't know what's happening within him. But what I do know is that because I believed I was unworthy, I kept replicating it over and over and over again. And I had a teacher once say, if you're struggling with money and you look at your bank account and you see a very small balance and it's been small for years, I want you to say, look how powerful I am. I keep creating this small bank account because the point is we're always creating. And so not to say, okay, now I'm going to blame myself for that, but to say, oh, I wonder what the core belief or idea about myself is, this constantly or continually replicating that. How can I start to shift that or change that and have a different awareness? And so I think the reason I say it's an experiment is the more aware and the more present I am, the more life becomes rich, the more I feel on purpose, the happier I am, the better my relationships are. And so I start wanting that more instead of the old way of doing it. And so it becomes really simple then. I think we actually change based on what we do want, not on what we don't want. So the more we start to practice this, it's like, oh, wow, this is energizing and fun.
Yeah, I have noticed that over time, what happens for me is that I expand my capacity for awareness. So at first, where it's feels like, oh, this is too much to keep up with. What, the whole time I'm having to ask myself these questions? Eventually, I've done it enough in one area that that starts to be my new autopilot. And and then I move it to another area and to another area. I'm reminded of yoga, actually. I have been doing yoga for 17 years. And so when I am doing a yoga class, I remember bringing a friend to a yoga class once. And I was like, at the end, I was like, oh, that was a great workout. She was like, that was way too easy. And I'm like, oh, yeah, because if you are just in the poses and you're not, okay, rotate this inner thigh this way, tighten this way. Every pose is a full body experience for me because I know every minor adjustment to do, and it happens within a second. I'm like in the pose and I'm like, and suddenly like my whole body's engaged versus just sort of standing there with your arms sort of out, like bending backward, whatever it is. And so it seems counterintuitive, but the longer that you do yoga, every pose has more of an opportunity for engagement. And the same is true for any area of awareness. The more that you practice this, you start to engage different parts of your psyche, different parts of your emotional levels, different parts of you see things on a different level, and you go beyond surface and you start to see the layers of every single moment. And once you unlock that for yourself, there's really no going back.
That's right. And that's the beauty of it, right? There is no going back. And then sometimes that feels like, oh my gosh, oh no, there's no going back, right? Because once we wake up or when we're in the process of waking up, the more we do that, the less we can go back to sleep. And that's very freeing at some moments. And then other moments, it's like, oh wow, I have to be accountable now. I have to actually be accountable for my life. But the beauty of that is I love that you're using yoga because that is truly the intention of yoga, right? Yes, it's a physical activity, but it really is more emotional and spiritual. It's like, even though I've done the same thing, I'm meeting myself in a new and unique way. There's a deeper level of this pose. There's a deeper awareness. And that's a parallel of our spiritual practice. I mean, I have woken up before and said, oh, I know what I meant now. What I mean is like, I wrote that in my book, but now I really understand it at a different level. Or I said that in an interview and I'm like, that's so interesting. I wonder what that means. But then there's a deeper awareness of that. And then another possibility for a deeper awareness. And at some point, it's like, there is no part of me that really just wants to go back to sleep and pretend like the world is happening to me. Because the greatest paradox is early in my journey, because I felt broken, my strategy was to be a high achiever, but it was based on this shaky foundation. So everything I would achieve would eventually crumble. So I could say, see, it is true, I'm unworthy. And now I'm like, no, I'm going to start with doing that. I'm going to start with reconnecting with this place within me that has infinite potential. And then the more I do that, and the more I realize purpose is a way of being, not an activity, then the greatest paradox, it feels like the world just starts to match that. It's like, oh, now I'm doing everything that I ever dreamt of, and I feel very fulfilled. But it's not because I did it to get fulfilled. It's very interesting and paradoxical.
There's a confusion often between visualization and true visioning. So once we get to that place of, okay, I need to consciously create my life, what does that process look like for you?
Time to move? Skip the hassles of selling during the holiday season and sell your home directly to Opendoor. Request an all-cash offer in minutes, close, and get paid in days. You can even pick your close date so you can move after New Year's. Start your move at Opendoor.com or download the Opendoor app. Opendoor is represented by Opendoor Brokerage Inc., license 02061130 in California, and Opendoor Brokerage LLC in its other markets. Terms and conditions apply.
Stop. 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 Had enough? Kick out mucus and quiet the cough with Mucinex 12-Hour DM for long-lasting cough and chest congestion relief. Buy Mucinex 12-Hour DM at your local retailer. Use as directed.
In my book, Conscious Creation, I have a 5-step process, and it's making peace with the past, overcoming core false beliefs, which is really a lot of what we've been talking about. And then we get to this place of visioning. So I'll answer that as, what's the difference between visualization and visioning? Visualization is primarily asking, what do I want to create? We do the vision boards, right? Those are really visualization boards. We put everything that we want to create, and then we hold the energy of that. And the idea is that we will manifest that. It will respond, and we will attract it. Visioning is something really different. And I use my friend Michael Beckwith's life visioning process. It's really about emptying. It's really about being open and receptive. It's about, to the best of our ability, healing what needs to be healed so that we can actually tap into that spiritual essence that we are, and then ask questions from that place. When I've had these deep intuitions that come from visioning, which is being quiet and asking the question, what's the highest possibility for my life? Listening intently to what comes up from inner wisdom, anytime it's come from that deep visioning, it's always been way more fulfilling and also way bigger than I would have imagined in my mind.
How do you help people set intentions that actually stick instead of, I'm actually even just talking to a friend right now. We've had this ongoing conversation, and she's like, but how do I figure out what I actually want? How do I figure out what to do with my life? And I've talked to her about this a number of times, and I love that. Feel like that's a huge switch for people, is you need to take the space to get quiet and ask questions, because if you're not, all of your inclinations are going to come from all of the messages you're hearing from everywhere else, because you're not spending time to listen to your own messages. But I feel
That's
like
right.
a big part that people miss is meeting that intuitive guidance with action. And so they're expecting like things to just fall into their lap. I feel like that's step one of learning about the law of attraction, is believing that after this long visualization process, somebody's just going to knock on your door and give you everything. And the funny thing is magical feeling things like that happen to me all the time, but it didn't really start until I started saying, okay, intuition, I'm going to act on you. I'm going to do the idea that you just gave me. And if I don't, then that's the only thing that I keep being fed. And then because I'm not taking action, I get into my head and I'm talking myself out of it. And then the other voice, the voice of doubt, is just as strong as the other one because I'm spending just as much time there. So now it's like, idea, let me do something about it. And I don't need to take it to completion even. Usually if I just take that first step, another step will reveal itself to me. But it's like I have to become that person who took that first step in order to be ready for the next one, and so on. And then eventually it just feels like my life is this ongoing process of guidance. But I find that there's this huge block for people of taking that step. How would you get them past that?
Yeah, well, I mean, it's interesting because I find, like you, it's either people don't want to go into the action or they actually want to just start with the action. Because a lot of our culture is like goal setting, intention setting, crush it, dominate. And a lot of people start there. And so that's why in conscious creation, the process I've created, we spend a lot of time on making peace with the past, overcoming core false beliefs. And then, as you said, the vitally important step is dedicating ourselves to being in the silence. And then through practice, we can start to discern, is this an idea that is coming to me from outside myself, like you said, or from my old programming? That one can be tricky. Or is this truly an intuition? And then when we get that intuition, then there's another art form of how do I sit with that for a period of time before launching right into the action. But a lot of us, especially people who use air quotes, people can't see it, but the spiritual people sometimes get stuck there. They just stay. I stay in the like, oh, I have this beautiful idea. And like you said, I'm waiting for someone to bring it to me. And sure, that can happen. But most of the time, I would say about 100% of the time, there's action that's required. So being clear and discerning, is this a deep intuition? That is a practice. And then from there, really giving that a concrete action. And honestly, that is what changed my life. About 16, 17 years ago, I started this intention setting process that has weekly action items. It's very, in some ways from the outside, it would look almost rigid, but I know that the ideas that come from the deep vision, then applying this process that has a lot of structure, that has been life-changing for me because it's the spirit, it's knowing, it's the intuition, and then it's also having the action in the quote unquote real world so that we can activate the vision.
Part of me wonders, because I've noticed a theme, and I don't want to bring it back to genders, but a lot of times women are talking themselves out of things. Men are taking the action without the visioning, but it's not necessarily men and women. I think it's potentially if you're connected to the masculine or the feminine energy, because for a really long time I was living in my masculine energy. And so I was that action taker rather than the sort of sit back and receive. So it really is a balance with that. And I used to be so worried about, like, I would get also overly engulfed in all of the research about stuff because I was so afraid of doing the wrong thing, making the wrong choice. And now I know that if I've spent some time in silence and I know the feeling of, okay, yeah, this is the next action. And that doesn't necessarily mean that it's still going to be a straight line. A lot of times I end up doing stuff and I'm like, oh, this isn't it. But I needed to experience that to know. I needed like the experiential part of it to know, come over here. Or I took that step and yeah, that's not where my business is going or where my life is going, but there's something key that I learned that I need to take onto this other path. And so it might look like this zigzag path or this up and down trend, but if you really understand what you've learned, what you've picked up on, who you became through that whole process, the entire thing makes sense and they were necessary steps anyways.
Yeah, looking back, I can always see, oh, that led to this and that led to this, right? One of the things, and I love that you're talking about it because it is true. I mean, gender roles are certainly changing, and we obviously have, the ability to tap into what we classify as masculine energy or feminine energy. But I agree that a lot of us get programmed based on our gender too, and that's changing some, but it's still sort of there, right? And a lot of us end up defaulting to that because that becomes a way of being. But when we get an intuition, when we have a divine idea, this is true for me, and for anyone listening, maybe you'll resonate with this. I'll get this divine idea that I know is an intuition, and I feel very deeply it's from vision. I immediately want to take action, or I immediately interpret, oh, I know that means this. And so for me, because I tend to jump right into the action, for me, it's learning how to pause and reflect and sit with, I wonder how this vision wants to manifest, instead of, oh, I have an idea of how to jump right into the action. And for someone else, if their tendency has been to like stay more in the inaction, we'd want to encourage ourselves to move into action, right? So it's not a one size fits all, but I do know that when we have the deep intuition, even if I quote unquote do it wrong, which there's no wrong, I will find myself learning a lot. I mean, I remember when I had a vision to start a spiritual community in San Francisco in 2012. I immediately interpreted what it's supposed to look like, and so I went into the action, and it wasn't flourishing the way that I wanted it to. And when I had a deeper surrender, then beautiful things came from it. Amazing things started to transpire that were way bigger, or quote unquote better than what I would have imagined based on my own programming. So just sitting with that vision, because sometimes someone really does just knock on the door. That's what happened for me. I know I write about it in Conscious Creation, but someone else caught something in vision, and there was a collaboration that was created from that partnership that was much greater than what I would have been able to do on my own.
That brings me to the question of connection, because so often it seems like, oh, going inward, being silent, visioning. And I think this is very common in this age where we're doing everything on our own. And maybe we all have that wound that I started with of like, that vulnerability is scary. And it's funny because if people listen to this podcast, they're like, what do you mean you have a problem with vulnerability? You openly share so much about yourself. And I'm like, yeah, that's not my issue. For some reason, that's always felt safe to me, even if people don't react in a supportive way. I have understood that the way that I deliver something has a huge effect on how people will receive it and how I'll feel. And so I've become good at, saying things with confidence. But it's when somebody else, when I open it up to relying on somebody else, that's when it feels really scary for me. And so how do you create those greater connections with people, and why are they so important in this overall idea of visioning and conscious creation?
Yeah, I mean, to me, community always is an important part of it. And like you said, I mean, whether it's COVID or technology or a combination of that, I think a lot of us have less, and many of us have less community or in-person community than we once did. So it's like we have connection in some ways, like this podcast. We're connecting with people that we probably are or possibly never going to meet. So there's that connection. But this deeper, authentic, let me create a space where I can really let you see me, that true vulnerability, I think is so vital in the process of awakening. I think about communities I've been involved with, and sometimes there are communities that are based really a lot in belief, and there's a limitation there. But the communities that are dedicated to really seeing beyond, beyond the programming and seeing the essential truth. When I do trainings, and a lot of us have done this, we'll just do 2 minutes or 3 minutes of looking at each other without words. There's something so powerful and so vulnerable about that, because we often use words as a way to not actually be seen. So I think true intimacy, yes, it is the way we heal shame, the way we awaken is by revealing ourselves. But as you said, there's a deeper level of that. And when I see from my spiritual essence to another person's spiritual essence, there's a vulnerability there that is so powerful and so beautiful. And that's a deep need for humanity. For all humans, we need that love and connection. And I think ultimately that's what we're all wanting.
You talk about asking questions that create that greater connection. What's a question that consistently surprises people with its impact?
My favorite questions are, and I'll talk about it first personally and then talk about it in relation to another or to a group of people. One of the questions I love is, how does it get even better than this? So, someone can lose their job. Oh, they can say, oh, how does it get even better than this? Or I will say, what is wanting to emerge here? My favorite question probably is, what are the infinite possibilities? Because a lot of times I might forget that there's not just, oh, this, I could do this or I could do this. No, there are actually infinite possibilities. So let me be in that. I think when it comes to another person, we could ask questions like, what would it feel like for us to have a deeper connection? How can I feel more connected with you? What can we do to feel more connected with one another? Those are questions that are really vulnerable, but when we ask ourselves or each other those questions, it will create more connection.
Well, we've covered so many amazing nuggets of wisdom. If you were to leave our listeners with one question or action item to sit with, what would it be?
You know, I do a lot of interviews, and usually a question like this comes up and I find myself saying something really similar. And so I'm called to say it again. And that is, if no one has yet told you today, or you haven't been aware of yourself, you are a whole and perfect being. You came into this world as a spark of divinity, and that's the ultimate truth of who and what you are. So if there's a question, the question I would leave someone with it is, if I'm not aware of that, how would I be aware of that more today? What can I do to experience my own divinity today?
I love that. Well, thank you so much for, following your own inner wisdom to bring this to the world, because it's so needed. This topic is one that's really close to my heart, because I think you have to understand it in order to really consciously create your life, which is where, for me, my true happiness lies. So for listeners that are interested in learning more about you and your book, Conscious Creation, where's the best place for them to find you?
tjwoodward.com. You can find all my socials there, all my books, and anything that I'm up to in the world.
Your challenge for this week is to start asking yourself some open-ended questions, because those are what open the door to what's possible. Here's what I'm getting at. Even some general questions like, how does it get even better than this? Or what haven't I thought of yet? Can shift your perspective in really powerful ways. TJ Woodward calls these questions a way to stay open and curious. They just give you room to see more and tap into a bigger vision for yourself. So this week, make it a habit. Start your mornings with these questions. When you take a long walk or a long drive, ask yourself an open-ended question. It's also a really powerful way to get more in tune with your own inner voice. Let them nudge you towards something a little deeper and a little clearer. And if you hear words just being parroted back, like things you've heard from your mother or reels that you've listened to on Instagram, challenge yourself to sit with it a little longer. Let the answer come from your core. You can find all of my amazing sponsors at mindlove.com/sponsors. You can also find me on Instagram. That's where I do most of my more intimate conversing with you all in my DMs. Again, I just want to say thank you for everyone who is continuously reaching out about episode 369. It means a lot. I love hearing your stories. I love knowing that there's a real human on the other side of this microphone. So thank you again. And that's all for today. So thanks for giving your mind a little love today, and I'll see you next week.
Thanks for tuning into Your Higher Frequency with Mind Love. Head to mindlove.com for a free gift to keep your vibes up until next week.